In January 2024, the United States federal debt crossed $34 trillion for the first time in history. By early 2026, it had passed $39 trillion. Global sovereign and private debt combined climbed to roughly $348 trillion at the end of 2025, a record. And here's the part nobody on cable news mentioned. Not a single serious economist in Washington, London, or Tokyo is trying to pay it back. They're not even pretending anymore. That's not a failure of the system. That is the system. And it was designed exactly this way, 332 years ago, in a single afternoon, by men who knew exactly what they were doing. History doesn't repeat, it patterns. This one is called the perpetual anchor, a pattern where debt isn't a problem to be solved. It's the foundation everything else is built on. July 27th, 1694. London. A group of 1,268 private investors hand King William III a loan of $1.2 million at 8% interest. The king needs the money to fight France. He's losing the war. He's running out of options. In exchange for the loan, the investors receive a royal charter to form something brand new, the Bank of England. They get the right to issue paper notes against the king's debt. They get a privileged position as banker to the government. But the most important clause is the one nobody talks about. The king never has to repay the principal. He only has to pay the interest, indefinitely. That single sentence rewrote the rules of money. To understand why, look at what came before. Habsburg Spain, the richest empire of the 16th and 17th centuries, defaulted on its sovereign debt at least 6 times between 1557 and 1662, 4 of them under Philip II alone. Each default forced the crown to renegotiate with Genoese and Fugger bankers at worse terms. The Spanish Empire, sitting on mountains of New World silver, went broke because monarchs treated debt as something you eventually pay back or walk away from. The English model flipped that logic upside down. If the principal never has to be repaid, default becomes irrational. The bondholders don't want their money back. They want the income stream. The government doesn't want to retire the debt. It wants the debt to exist, because the debt is what gives the bank its reason to exist, and the bank is what funds the next war. It worked. By the early 1700s, the British government could borrow at much lower rates than France. By 1815, that gap is part of why London beat Napoleon at Waterloo. Not better generals, cheaper money. The same arrangement appeared 106 years later in Paris. January 18th, 1800. Napoleon, fresh off his coup, signs the founding decree of the Banque de France. Same architecture. Private shareholders, public credit, perpetual interest. Then Berlin, January 1st, 1876. The Reichsbank, founded 5 years after German unification, designed in the wake of the war indemnity France had been forced to pay. Then Tokyo, October 10th, 1882, the Bank of Japan, modeled almost line for line on the National Bank of Belgium, which had been modeled on the Bank of England. Then Washington, December 23rd, 1913. President Woodrow Wilson signs the Federal Reserve Act in the late afternoon, 2 days before Christmas, with most senators already heading home for the holidays. Same architecture. A public-private hybrid. A government that issues debt. A central bank that holds and trades that debt. A perpetual interest stream, 5 empires, 5 different centuries, the exact same blueprint, and the pattern didn't stop there. Here's why it keeps happening. Why every successful state eventually adopts the perpetual anchor. A government bond is not really a loan. It's a financial instrument that performs a job no other instrument can perform. It gives the entire economy a benchmark for what risk-free means. Think of it like sea level. You can't measure the height of a mountain without sea level. You can't price a corporate bond, a mortgage, a pension fund liability, or a derivative without a risk-free rate to compare it to. And the only thing that can serve as that benchmark is the debt of a government that controls its own currency and is trusted not to default. Which means the debt has to exist. Permanently. In enormous quantities. Liquid enough that someone can buy or sell $1 billion of it on a Tuesday afternoon without moving the price. This is the part most people get backwards. Government bonds aren't issued because the government needs the money. A government that prints its own currency never needs to borrow in that currency. The bonds exist because the financial system needs them. Pension funds need long-duration assets. Banks need collateral. Foreign central banks need reserves, derivatives. Markets need a settlement floor. The proof is the strangest moment in American financial history. January 8, 1835. Under President Andrew Jackson, the United States federal debt is paid down to zero, the only time in the history of the country. 2 years later, the Panic of 1837 begins. A 6-year depression follows. State banks collapse. There's no federal benchmark, no risk-free asset, no anchor. The lesson got absorbed quietly. Nobody has tried it since. The mechanism is geometric. The bigger the economy, the larger the perpetual anchor needs to be. Growth requires more debt, not less, and that's where it gets uncomfortable. As of early 2026, the configuration looks like this. United States gross federal debt, just under $39 trillion and climbing roughly $7 billion per day. Japanese government debt, above $9 trillion in dollar terms and somewhere between 230% and 237% of GDP, a level that economists in 1995 said would trigger collapse within a decade. It didn't. In the European Union, government debt averages around 82% of GDP, with Italy at 137%, France above 115%, and Greece at 146%. None of these governments is trying to pay any of it back. What they're managing is something else entirely. The architecture of who holds whose debt. In the early 2010s, foreign holders owned close to 48% of US treasuries. By the end of 2025, that share had fallen to about 31%. China has been a steady net seller. Its direct holdings dropped from over $1 trillion in 2020 to under $700 billion by late 2025. The Federal Reserve, U.S. households, and U.S. institutional investors have absorbed most of the slack. That shift matters because it tells you who depends on whom. When the United States, the EU, and the G7 froze roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves in February 2022, it wasn't a sanction in the old sense. It was a demonstration. The message: the Western bond market isn't just an investment. It's the operating system, and the operator can revoke your access. That power exists because of the depth of the treasury market. No other bond market in the world can absorb the trades, settle the volumes, or anchor the derivatives. Not the German bond market, not the JGB market, not Chinese government bonds, which foreign investors largely cannot freely trade. The bond vigilante theory, the idea that bond markets discipline reckless governments, has been tested for 30 years and mostly failed. Japan crossed every supposed red line. Yields stayed near zero for most of that period. The United States ran trillion-dollar deficits through the 2010s and 2020s. Yields rose, then stabilized. The discipline doesn't come while you hold reserve currency status. It comes after. And by then, the question is no longer about debt. It's about which system replaces yours. There's no clear successor. The yuan isn't fully convertible. The euro is fragmented across 20 finance ministries. Gold doesn't settle electronic trades. Bitcoin can't absorb a single afternoon of treasury volume, so the perpetual anchor holds, because the alternative is a world without one. Can the pattern be broken? Honest answer: rarely and never cleanly. The historical exits are short. Britain ran down its imperial debt slowly across the 20th century, but only because it transferred the anchor role to Washington. The system didn't end. The address changed. The Soviet Union exited the global debt system entirely after 1917 by repudiating Tsarist bonds, and the cost was 7 decades of isolation from international capital. Argentina has tried to walk away from sovereign debt repeatedly since 2001, and each attempt has produced deeper poverty than the debt itself. The honest reading of 3 centuries of evidence is this: nobody escapes the perpetual anchor by paying it off. They escape by being replaced. Adam Smith saw this coming. In The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, 82 years after the founding of the Bank of England, he warned that the practice of funding had gradually enfeebled every state which has adopted it. He may still be right, but eventually has now lasted 332 years, longer than the lifespan of most empires that ever existed. The question isn't whether the system is sustainable. The question is whether anything else can replace it before it collapses on its own weight. Pattern confirmed. The perpetual anchor isn't a debt to be repaid. It's the floor every modern economy stands on, and removing it has always been more dangerous than carrying it. Now I want your take. Do you think this same pattern is unfolding today, or is this time truly different? Tell me your perspective in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.